Sarah Jenkins stands in her meticulously maintained garden, the early morning sunlight casting long shadows across her prized vegetable beds. At 42, she's spent the last 5 years transforming what was once a barren suburban lawn into a thriving ecosystem. Her hands, still bearing the faint traces of yesterday's soil, brush against the tomato vines as she inspects their progress. The morning dew catches the light, turning each droplet into a tiny prism. The sound of a car door slamming breaks her morning reverie. Through the morning mist, she spots the distinctive white uniform of a code enforcement officer, his badge catching the sunlight as he strides purposefully up her walkway. Behind him, barely visible through her curtained window, Sarah's neighbor Karen Matthews adjusts her position, poorly concealing her presence as she watches the scene unfold. "Miss Jenkins," the officer's voice carries an edge of predetermined judgment. "I'm Officer Reynolds from the Municipal Code Enforcement Division." He pulls out his tablet, fingers hovering over the screen with practiced efficiency. Sarah notices how he positions himself, slightly turned away, as if he's already decided this interaction will be brief and one-sided. "We've received multiple complaints about your—" He pauses, glancing with obvious distaste at her sophisticated composting system, waste disposal situation. The system, a carefully engineered 3-bin setup that Sarah designed herself, has been helping feed not just her garden, but the community garden project she started at the local youth center. Sarah begins to explain. "Officer, this is a controlled composting system. I'm an environmental." But he cuts her off with a raised hand, something he wouldn't dare do in her courtroom, if he only knew. "Ma'am, the regulations are clear." He gestures toward the bins, where kitchen scraps are transforming into rich, black soil through a carefully monitored process. This type of waste management isn't permitted in residential areas. His statement is delivered with the confidence of someone who hasn't bothered to actually read the full municipal code. Through her peripheral vision, Sarah catches movement behind Karen's curtains, the unmistakable glint of a phone camera lens. This isn't the first time she's noticed her neighbor documenting her activities. Over the past 3 weeks, Karen's amateur surveillance has become increasingly obvious, though this is the first time it's resulted in official action. The officer starts writing the citation, his tablet pen scratching against the screen with unnecessary force. "You'll need to remove this entire setup within 48 hours, he announces, not bothering to look up. "The fine is $500, with additional penalties if you fail to comply with the removal order." Sarah remains perfectly still, her lawyer's mind already cataloging every detail of this interaction. His dismissive tone, the lack of proper procedure, the selective enforcement she's witnessed in her neighborhood. She thinks about Mrs. Chen 3 doors down, who received a similar citation last month for her traditional herb garden, while the Andersons' overflowing compost pile remains unchallenged. "Officer Reynolds," she says calmly, accepting the citation with a steady hand, "could you please clarify which specific code this violates?" Her question carries the weight of 15 years of environmental law experience, though he doesn't recognize the precise, practiced tone. He shuffles uncomfortably, clearly not expecting to be questioned. "It's a public nuisance violation, ma'am." Section 8, paragraph. He trails off, flipping through his tablet with increasing uncertainty. "I see," Sarah responds, her voice level but firm. "And have you documented similar violations at other properties in the neighborhood?" She knows the answer. Her security cameras have captured plenty of evidence suggesting otherwise. The officer hastily finishes the citation process, eager to end the increasingly uncomfortable interaction. As he walks away, Sarah notices Karen's curtains finally falling still. She takes a deep breath, inhaling the rich scent of her garden, and pulls out her phone. "Janet," she speaks to her legal assistant, "clear my afternoon schedule. We have some research to do." The morning sun climbs higher, illuminating her garden in full now. The composting bins, far from being a nuisance, have helped create this oasis of sustainability. Sarah allows herself a small smile, knowing that Officer Reynolds and Karen have unwittingly set in motion something much bigger than a simple citation dispute. They just don't know who they're dealing with. The sleek elevator doors of Wheeler & Associates Environmental Law slide open as Sarah strides into the office, the citation burning a hole in her designer briefcase. Her corner office, with its view of downtown, is usually a sanctuary of legal victories, but today it becomes a war room. The morning's confrontation has awakened something in her, a familiar fire that's won her countless environmental justice cases. Janet, she calls to her assistant, who appears instantly with a steaming cup of fair trade coffee. Cancel my 2 o'clock with the Sierra Club. We need to dive into the city's public records. Janet's eyebrows raise. She knows that tone. It's the same one Sarah used before bringing down 3 major corporations for illegal dumping last year. Sarah's fingers fly across her keyboard, accessing the city's database. As a frequent expert witness in environmental cases, she knows every digital nook and cranny of municipal record-keeping. The citation numbers start populating her screen, and with each click, a disturbing picture emerges. Janet, are you seeing this? Sarah's voice tightens as she projects the data onto her office's wall screen. Janet moves closer, her coffee forgotten on the desk. In the past 12 months, there have been 143 waste management citations in our neighborhood. She pulls up a demographic map of the area. Look at the distribution. Red dots begin appearing on the map, each representing a citation. They cluster heavily around homes owned by people of color, creating an unmistakable pattern. Janet's coffee cup slips from her hand, splattering across the pristine carpet, but neither woman notices. 87%. Sarah whispers, her voice barely containing her anger. 87% of all citations issued to just 15% of the neighborhood. She pulls up more data: property values, historical records, enforcement patterns. And look at this. White-owned properties with identical violations received warnings instead of citations. Some weren't even approached. The evidence mounts as Sarah digs deeper. She discovers that Officer Reynolds has issued 60% of these citations, all following a similar pattern. Her security cameras had caught Karen Matthews photographing other neighbors' yards too, all belonging to families of color. The pieces are falling into perfect, infuriating place. Janet, get me everything you can on similar cases nationwide, and pull the environmental impact studies we did for the Thompson case, the one about urban composting benefits. Sarah's mind is already building a defense that's really an offense. Also, contact our investigator. I want photos of every composting setup in a 5-block radius. As Janet hurries out, Sarah notices a new email from Karen Matthews to the Homeowners Association, accidentally copied to the entire neighborhood list. It details concerns about property values and certain elements changing the character of our community. Sarah's jaw tightens as she adds it to her growing evidence file. She pulls up the municipal codes, not the simplified version Officer Reynolds quoted, but the complete environmental regulations she helped revise 3 years ago as a consulting expert. Section 8, Paragraph 3, she reads aloud, a smile playing at her lips. Sustainable waste management practices, including controlled composting, are encouraged in residential areas to promote environmental responsibility. The afternoon sun casts long shadows across her office as Sarah compiles her case. She's not just fighting a citation anymore. She's exposing a system. Her phone buzzes. It's Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman down the street who received a similar citation last month. Yes, Mrs. Chen. Sarah answers, her voice gentle but determined. I think it's time we had that conversation about your citation too. As she ends the call, Janet returns with a stack of files and a determined look. Sarah, you need to see this, she says, spreading out documents across the desk. I found 5 other neighborhoods in the city with identical patterns, and look who signed off on the enforcement policy changes 2 years ago. Sarah's eyes narrow as she reads the name. Judge William Harrison, the same judge scheduled to hear her case. The pieces aren't just falling into place. They're building a foundation for something much bigger than a simple composting dispute. Janet, Sarah says, her voice carrying the weight of decision, clear my schedule for the next 3 days. We're not just fighting a cetacean anymore. We're going to change the system. The setting sun catches her window, casting a fiery glow across the scattered evidence of injustice, ready to be brought into the light. The digital clock on Sarah's home office wall blinks 2:47 a.m., but sleep is the furthest thing from her mind. Scattered across her desk are satellite images of her neighborhood, each marked with red pins indicating cetacean locations. Her laptop screen glows with municipal codes and legal precedents, while 3 empty coffee cups testify to her determination. "Got you," she whispers, zooming in on Google Earth imagery from the past year. The Anderson family's massive compost pile is clearly visible from the satellite view, far larger than her own setup, yet they've never received a single warning. She adds it to her growing presentation, already 47 slides deep. Her phone buzzes. It's Janet, still at the office despite the hour. "Sarah, you won't believe what I found in the archived HOA meetings. 3 years ago, when the first Black families moved into the neighborhood, they created new property maintenance standards. The timing." "Send it all." Sarah interrupts, her fingers already flying across the keyboard. "And Janet, get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be interesting." She hangs up, knowing her assistant won't rest either. That's why they make such a formidable team. The motion sensors she installed after receiving the citation ping her phone. On the security feed, she watches Karen Matthews creeping along the property line with her phone camera, documenting Sarah's yard under cover of darkness. Sarah clicks record, adding another piece to her evidence pile. The irony of Karen unknowingly helping build the case against herself isn't lost on her. Sarah pulls up the 1983 municipal code she discovered buried in the city archives. It was never officially repealed, making it technically still valid. Sustainable waste management practices shall be encouraged and protected as vital to community environmental health. The language is beautifully clear, written in an era before corporate interests muddied environmental regulations. Her doorbell rings, surprising her in the pre-dawn quiet. It's Mrs. Chen, clutching a folder of her own citations. "I couldn't sleep." The elderly woman apologizes. "I found all my garden violation notices from the past year." Sarah welcomes her in, noting how her neighbor's hands shake slightly as she spreads the papers on the desk. Together, they review Mrs. Chen's documents, finding the same pattern. Officer Reynolds, aggressive enforcement, no warnings given. "Mrs. Chen," Sarah says gently, "would you be willing to testify about this?" The older woman straightens her shoulders, nodding with quiet dignity. "They tried to make me remove my grandmother's herb garden. Enough is enough." As Mrs. Chen leaves, Sarah begins preparing her professional presentation setup. She won't just bring papers to court. She'll create an undeniable visual narrative. Her projector, usually reserved for corporate environmental cases, will turn courtroom 3B into a theater of justice. She reviews her brother's surveillance company footage one more time. The cameras he installed, top-of-the-line models with night vision, have captured 3 weeks of selective enforcement in crystal-clear resolution. Officer Reynolds walking past white neighbors' violations without a glance. Karen photographing only certain properties. The evidence is damning. Sarah finally allows herself a moment of reflection. In 15 years of environmental law, she's taken down corporate giants and won seemingly unwinnable cases. But this feels different, more personal, more vital. This isn't just about her compost bins anymore. It's about every Mrs. Chen in every neighborhood facing quiet, systematic discrimination. The sun begins to rise as she puts the finishing touches on her presentation. Her phone buzzes again. A message from Janet with one last piece of evidence. Judge Harrison's voting record on environmental cases involving minority communities. Sarah's eyes narrow as she reads the statistics. Everything connects. She gathers her materials, heading for a quick shower before court. In her garden, the morning light catches the dew on her vegetables, the fruits of her sustainable practices. The citation, now just one small piece in a larger puzzle, sits on her desk. Officer Reynolds and Judge Harrison expect a simple administrative hearing. What they'll get is a masterclass in environmental justice, years of legal expertise distilled into one decisive moment. As Sarah dressed for court, she allows herself a small smile. They thought they were citing a negligent homeowner. Instead, they've awakened a force for change, and she's more than ready for the battle ahead. Courtroom 3B buzzes with unusual energy for a citation hearing. Sarah's heels click purposefully across the polished floor as she wheels in her presentation equipment, each step measured and confident. The regular morning defendants, mostly traffic violations and minor infractions, watch curiously as she sets up her professional-grade projector and laptop. Officer Reynolds slouches in the front row, scrolling through his phone with the bored demeanor of someone who's done this 100 times. He barely glances up when Sarah arranges 3 leather briefcases on the defense table, their brass buckles gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Behind him, Karen Matthews slips into the back row, trying to appear inconspicuous while craning her neck for a better view. All rise. The bailiff's voice cuts through the murmur. Judge William Harrison sweeps in, his black robes billowing slightly. He settles into his chair with the practiced ease of someone who's ruled on thousands of minor violations, already reaching for what he assumes will be another routine citation file. Case number 2024 CV 789, City versus Jenkins, improper waste disposal. The clerk announces. Judge Harrison doesn't even look up, his pen hovering over the standard fine form. How do you plead? Sarah rises, her charcoal designer suit a stark contrast to the casual attire of other defendants. Before entering a plea or honor, I request permission to present evidence relevant to this citation. Her voice carries the quiet authority that swayed corporate boardrooms and federal judges alike. Judge Harrison finally looks up, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. His expression shifts almost imperceptibly as he takes in Sarah's professional appearance and setup. Ms. Jenkins, this is a simple citation hearing. We don't normally. Your Honor. Sarah interrupts smoothly. Environmental Protection Act Section 1983 guarantees the right to present exculpatory evidence in any proceeding involving waste management citations. She pauses, letting her legal expertise hang in the air. I'm sure you're familiar with the statute. A ripple of whispers crosses the gallery. Officer Reynolds sits up straighter, his phone forgotten. Karen Matthews leans forward so far she's practically falling off her bench. Very well, Judge Harrison concedes, though his tone suggests he's merely humoring her. You have 5 minutes. Sarah's first slide illuminates the wall. Satellite imagery of the neighborhood, citation locations marked in glowing red dots. Your Honor, in the past 12 months, our neighborhood has seen 143 waste management citations. She clicks to the next slide, demographic data filling the screen. 87% of these citations were issued to minority homeowners, despite representing only 15% of the community. Judge Harrison's bored expression cracks slightly. Officer Reynolds shifts uncomfortably in his seat as Sarah plays time-stamped footage from her security cameras, showing him walking past multiple violations at white-owned properties without pause. Furthermore, Sarah continues, her voice steady. The municipal code actually encourages sustainable waste management practices. She projects the 1983 ordinance, its language crystal clear. My composting system, far from being a violation, exemplifies the environmental stewardship our city claims to promote. Mrs. Chen stands quietly in the gallery, her presence a silent testament. Sarah clicks through more evidence. Karen's HOA emails, historical enforcement patterns, property value data. Each slide builds an irrefutable case not just against the citation, but against the system itself. Judge Harrison's demeanor has completely transformed. He removes his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose as the evidence mounts. The 5 minutes stretch to 10, then 15, as Sarah methodically dismantles every aspect of the citation. And finally, Your Honor, Sarah concludes, pulling out a bound report. I've prepared an environmental impact study demonstrating the benefits of residential composting systems like mine. She places copies on the bench and prosecution table. You'll find my credentials as an environmental lawyer and expert witness on page 1. The courtroom falls silent. Officer Reynolds stares at his shoes. Karen Matthews has shrunk into her seat. Judge Harrison looks from the report to Sarah, then back again, the weight of the moment visible in his expression. Ms. Jenkins, he begins, his voice notably different from his earlier dismissive tone. I believe we need to examine this matter more thoroughly. He picks up the report, his judicial demeanor cracking further as he reads her impressive credentials. Perhaps we should move this to my chambers. Sarah stands perfectly still, her case presented, the truth laid bare in the harsh fluorescent light of courtroom 3B. The morning sun streams through the high windows, and for a moment, justice feels not just possible, but inevitable. Judge Harrison's chambers feel smaller than usual as Sarah Jenkins follows him inside, her evidence files tucked precisely under her arm. The afternoon sun streams through Venetian blinds, creating prison bar shadows across his polished mahogany desk. Officer Reynolds awkwardly takes a seat in the corner, his usual confidence deflated by Sarah's presentation. Ms. Jenkins, Judge Harrison begins, adjusting his reading glasses as he studies her curriculum vitae. I see you're a senior partner at Wheeler and Associates Environmental Law. His finger traces down the page. Harvard Law, lead counsel in Sierra Club, v. Metropolitan Industries, special advisor to the EPA. His voice trails off as he realizes exactly who he's been dismissing in his courtroom. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah responds, her voice measured. I'd specialized in environmental justice cases for 15 years. But today, I'm here as a citizen watching systematic discrimination unfold in my own neighborhood. She opens her laptop, bringing up a familiar company name. Though I must say I was surprised to see the connection between these selective enforcement patterns and McKinley Enterprises. The judge's hand freezes on the page. His brother-in-law's company, currently under investigation for toxic dumping in minority neighborhoods, fills the screen. Sarah continues softly. The same demographic targeting, the same selective enforcement, the same disregard for environmental regulations. That case is not relevant to this hearing, Judge Harrison interjects, but his voice lacks conviction. With respect, Your Honor, it's entirely relevant. Sarah pulls up a split screen, one side showing cetacean patterns in their neighborhood, the other showing McKinley's dump site locations. The correlation is unmistakable. The systemic bias in environmental enforcement doesn't just happen at the corporate level. It starts in neighborhoods like mine. Officer Reynolds shifts uncomfortably in his chair as Sarah produces his complete citation history. Officer Reynolds has issued 347 citations in the past year. Would you care to guess the demographic breakdown? She doesn't wait for an answer. 93% to minority homeowners. The pattern is consistent across all categories, from composting to yard maintenance. Through the chamber windows, they can hear the murmur of waiting defendants in the courtroom. Sarah gestures toward the sound. Every day, people walk into this courtroom expecting justice. They trust the system to be fair, impartial, colorblind. But the data tells a different story. Judge Harrison removes his glasses, suddenly looking older. Ms. Jenkins, what exactly are you seeking here? Justice, Your Honor. Not just for my citation, but for Mrs. Chen's herb garden, for the Rodriguez family's rainwater collection system, for every resident facing selective enforcement of environmental regulations. She pauses, letting her words sink in. And perhaps a chance for this court to be part of the solution rather than perpetuating the problem. The judge stands, pacing behind his desk. The shadows from the blinds cross his face as he moves, highlighting the conflict in his expression. You realize the implications of what you're presenting, the scope of the review this would require. Sarah's response is interrupted by a knock. The bailiff enters with an urgent message. Reporters from the local news have gathered outside the courtroom, alerted by the unusual length of a simple citation hearing. Judge Harrison's eyes narrow at this development. Your Honor, Sarah says quietly, this can go two ways. We can address these systemic issues openly, transparently, and work toward real change. Or, she lets the alternative hang in the air, her meaning clear. The McKinley case files seem to pulse on her laptop screen. Officer Reynolds finally speaks up from his corner. "Judge, I never intended. I was just following the established patterns of enforcement." His defense sounds hollow even to his own ears. Sarah turns to him. "Intent isn't the issue, Officer Reynolds. The impact is." She pulls up one final document, a draft proposal for reforming the city's environmental enforcement policies. "I took the liberty of preparing some suggestions for moving forward." Judge Harrison sinks back into his chair, the weight of the moment visible in his posture. Through his chamber windows, the afternoon sun illuminates the courthouse's motto carved in stone: "Equal justice under law." He stares at it for a long moment before turning back to Sarah. "Ms. Jenkins," he says finally, "I believe we need to continue this discussion. But first, I have a citation to dismiss." The light in courtroom 3B has shifted to late afternoon amber when Judge Harrison emerges from his chambers, his face bearing the weight of revelation. Sarah follows, her posture relaxed but purposeful, while Officer Reynolds trails behind, looking distinctly uncomfortable. The remaining audience, including Karen Matthews and Mrs. Chen, straighten in their seats, sensing something significant is about to unfold. Before we proceed, Judge Harrison announces, his voice carrying a new note of gravity, "I'd like to enter several items into the official record." He nods to Sarah, who begins queuing up her evidence on the large display screen. The gallery watches, transfixed, as damning statistics fill the wall. The court has reviewed extensive evidence of discriminatory enforcement patterns. Judge Harrison continues, each word measured and deliberate. Ms. Jenkins has presented compelling documentation that extends far beyond her individual citation. His eyes sweep the courtroom, lingering momentarily on Karen Matthews, who seems to be trying to disappear into her seat. Sarah stands at the presentation computer, methodically displaying each piece of evidence. Security footage shows Officer Reynolds walking past the Andersons' overflowing compost pile without a second glance, then writing up Mrs. Chen's meticulously maintained herb garden the same day. Karen Matthews appears in multiple clips, photographing only certain properties, a pattern so obvious it draws audible murmurs from the gallery. Furthermore, Sarah interjects smoothly, "I'd like to direct the court's attention to these satellite images." She switches to a chronological view of the neighborhood. Over the past 18 months, you'll notice that citations cluster exclusively around properties owned by minorities, despite identical conditions existing throughout the community. Officer Reynolds shifts in his seat as his own body camera footage plays, revealing stark differences in his tone and approach between white and minority homeowners. His earlier bravado has evaporated, replaced by a growing awareness of his role in the systemic issue. From the back of the courtroom, a reporter from the local newspaper scribbles furiously in her notepad. She'd arrived expecting a routine citation hearing, but found herself witnessing something far more newsworthy. Sarah notices her presence but continues undeterred, her preparations too thorough to be rattled by media attention. "Your Honor," Sarah says, pulling up the 1983 Municipal Code. "This ordinance not only permits but encourages sustainable waste management practices. The selective enforcement we've documented represents a direct contradiction of both the letter and spirit of this law." Judge Harrison nods, then does something unprecedented in his 20 years on the bench. He steps down from the podium, walking to the center of the courtroom. Ms. Jenkins has brought to light disturbing patterns that extend beyond her individual case. This court cannot and will not ignore evidence of systematic discrimination in our community. Karen Matthews starts to stand, perhaps to protest, but the judge's stern glance freezes her in place. Moreover, he continues, the environmental benefits of responsible composting and sustainable practices have been clearly demonstrated. Ms. Jenkins's system, far from being a violation, should serve as a model for our community. Sarah quietly places one final document on the judge's bench, a petition signed by dozens of neighborhood residents, all sharing similar experiences of selective enforcement. Mrs. Chen's signature appears on the first page, her careful handwriting a testament to her courage in coming forward. In light of this evidence, Judge Harrison announces, his voice filling the courtroom, "I am not only dismissing this citation, but also ordering an immediate review of all environmental enforcement practices in our jurisdiction." He turns to Officer Reynolds. "Furthermore, I am recommending mandatory bias training for all enforcement officers and a complete overhaul of citation procedures." The courtroom erupts in hushed conversations. Sarah maintains her professional composure, but a slight smile plays at the corners of her mouth. Officer Reynolds stares at his citation book, as if seeing it for the first time, while Karen Matthews attempts to slip out unnoticed. "Ms. Jenkins," Judge Harrison concludes, "this court owes you a debt of gratitude for bringing these issues to light. Sometimes it takes one person willing to stand up to reveal the cracks in our system." He pauses, looking directly at her. "And sometimes that person must be precisely someone like you. Someone they never saw coming." The late afternoon sun streams through the high courthouse windows, illuminating particles of dust in the air, dancing like justice finally set in motion. The days following the courtroom revelation bring swift and unexpected changes to the community. Sarah sits in her garden, sipping morning coffee and watching the early sun illuminate her composting bins, the humble catalysts of transformation. Her phone hasn't stopped buzzing since the local newspaper ran the front-page headline, "Environmental Lawyer Exposes Systemic Bias in Local Code Enforcement." A tentative knock at her garden gate draws her attention. It's Officer Reynolds, out of uniform, looking markedly different from the confrontational figure who'd issued her citation 2 weeks ago. "Miss Jenkins," he begins, clearing his throat, "I wondered if we could talk." Sarah gestures to the garden bench beside her. Reynolds sits, his discomfort visible as he struggles to find words. "I've been doing this job for 12 years, he finally says, staring at his hands. "Yesterday, during our first bias training session, they showed us your statistical analysis. I didn't think." "You didn't think you were part of a systemic problem," Sarah finishes gently. "Few people do, Officer Reynolds. That's why the data is so important. Numbers don't lie, even when we lie to ourselves." Down the street, Mrs. Chen tends to her herb garden, now flourishing without the threat of citations. 2 other neighbors chat with her, notepads in hand, learning about traditional Chinese medicinal plants. The scene represents exactly the kind of community engagement Sarah had hoped to foster. The department is implementing all of Judge Harrison's recommendations. Reynolds continues, seeming to find his voice. New oversight committees, revised citation procedures, mandatory documentation of all interactions. He pauses, then adds quietly, "I've requested a transfer to the Environmental Protection Unit. I thought, maybe I could be part of the solution." Sarah studies him thoughtfully. "Change starts with awareness, Officer Reynolds. What matters is what we do once we know better." Their conversation is interrupted by an unexpected sight. Karen Matthews approaching, clutching something in her hands. She hovers uncertainly at the garden gate, her usual confidence notably absent. "Sarah," she begins, then stops, seemingly struggling with what to say. Finally, she holds out what she's carrying. A well-worn book on composting. "I've been doing some reading," Karen admits, her voice small. "And I noticed your tomatoes always look better than mine." The admission costs her obvious effort. "I thought maybe you could show me how your system works." Sarah exchanges a glance with Officer Reynolds, who looks as surprised as she feels. "Of course," she says, standing to open the gate. "Sustainable practices work better when we share them." As if on cue, a city vehicle pulls up. A worker begins installing a new sign, "Model Sustainable Garden, Community Education Site." It's part of Judge Harrison's broader initiative to transform the neighborhood into a showcase for environmental responsibility. Later that afternoon, Sarah hosts the first meeting of the newly formed Community Environmental Justice Council in her garden. Faces both familiar and new fill the space. Mrs. Chen with her knowledge of traditional farming practices, Officer Reynolds offering insights on policy reform, even Karen Matthews sitting quietly in the back, taking notes. Judge Harrison makes a brief appearance, out of his robes and looking more human. Ms. Jenkins, he says, surveying the diverse group gathered in her garden. When you came to my courtroom, you didn't just change policy, you changed perspectives. He gestures to the thriving garden. Sometimes justice grows from unexpected seeds. As the meeting progresses, Sarah notices small transformations happening around her. Former adversaries engage in constructive dialogue. Neighbors who never spoke before share gardening tips. Officer Reynolds discusses environmental regulations with genuine interest rather than bureaucratic detachment. The sun begins to set, casting long shadows across the garden that once stood accused, but now stands as a symbol of change. Sarah's phone buzzes, a message from Janet about 3 other communities requesting similar reform initiatives. She smiles, knowing that what started with a simple citation has grown into something far more significant. In her compost bins, kitchen scraps transform slowly into rich, black soil, a quiet reminder that change, like nature itself, requires patience, care, and the courage to break down old systems to nurture new growth. 6 months after the courtroom confrontation, Sarah's garden hosts the inaugural Community Environmental Summit. White tent tops flutter in the autumn breeze as residents from across the city gather to learn about sustainable practices. Her once contested composting system now serves as the centerpiece of a larger demonstration area, complete with educational placards and visiting school groups. And here's where the magic happens. Sarah explains to a group of wide-eyed third graders, showing them how kitchen scraps transform into garden gold. Among them is Karen Matthews' daughter, who eagerly takes notes for her science project on environmental sustainability. Karen stands at the back of the group, a proud smile replacing her former suspicious scowl. Judge Harrison arrives just as Sarah finishes her presentation. He's carrying a thick folder, the final report on the city's environmental enforcement reform. "You'll want to see this," he says, handing it to her. "Every recommendation you made has been officially adopted by the City Council. They're implementing the new guidelines across all districts." Sarah flips through the pages, noting familiar passages from her original proposal. The statistics tell a new story now. Citations evenly distributed, enforcement focused on actual environmental hazards rather than selective targeting, and a marked increase in community participation in sustainable initiatives. "There's more," the judge continues, leading her to a quiet corner of the garden. "The State Environmental Protection Office wants to use our reform system as a model for other cities. They're calling it the Jenkins Protocol. Comprehensive guidelines for equitable environmental enforcement." Officer Reynolds, now Sergeant Reynolds of the Environmental Protection Unit, approaches with his own update. "We've completed the first round of community officer training," he reports, genuine enthusiasm in his voice. "Every enforcement officer is now required to complete environmental justice certification before receiving their badge." Mrs. Chen waves from her herb garden next door, where she's teaching a workshop on traditional sustainable farming practices. Her previously cited garden has become a registered historical site, preserving cultural heritage while promoting environmental education. Students from the local university's environmental studies program regularly visit to learn from her expertise. As the summit continues, Sarah notices small but significant changes throughout her neighborhood. The Anderson family, whose compost pile once went unsighted, now maintains a proper system modeled after hers. Karen Matthews leads the neighborhood recycling initiative, channeling her former monitoring energy into actually improving the community. Ms. Jenkins, a young law student, approaches, notebook in hand. "Your case study is part of our environmental justice curriculum now. Would you consider speaking at our symposium next month?" Sarah agrees, remembering her own journey and the importance of inspiring the next generation of advocates. The local news crew arrives to cover the summit, the same reporter who witnessed the courtroom revelation now documenting the community's transformation. "How does it feel?" she asks Sarah. seeing your single act of resistance create such widespread change? Sarah considers the question, watching the diverse crowd mingling in her garden. It was never about winning a case, she responds thoughtfully. It was about showing how environmental justice and community building go hand in hand. When we protect our environment equitably, we protect each other. As the day winds down, Sarah finds a quiet moment in her garden. The composting bins that sparked this revolution continue their quiet work of transformation. A butterfly lands on a flowering bush, nature's reminder that change, though sometimes challenging, brings unexpected beauty. Judge Harrison joins her for a final word. "You know," he reflects, "in 20 years on the bench, I've signed thousands of orders, but none as important as dismissing that citation. Sometimes the smallest cases have the biggest impact." The summit ends with a community dinner, tables stretched across several yards, now unfenced and open. Mrs. Chen's herbs season the dishes, vegetables from Sarah's garden fill the plates, and conversation flows freely between neighbors once divided by prejudice and misunderstanding. As twilight settles over the gathering, Sarah raises her glass in a quiet toast, not to victory in court, but to the harder-won victory of changed hearts and minds. In her garden, the evening air carries the promise of continued growth, both in the soil and in the community that tends it. The citation that started it all hangs framed in her office now, a reminder that justice, like composting, transforms what some consider waste into something valuable, if only given the chance to grow.